It is past midnight in Moscow, August 1989, and Klaus Meine cannot sleep. He sits on the edge of a narrow bed in the Hotel Ukraina, one of Stalin's great gray towers, a hotel notepad balanced on his knee and a stub of a pencil in his hand. Outside his window, the Moskva River moves dark and slow, and somewhere below, past the checkpoint lights, a soldier stands guard near a stage that should never have existed in this city. Klaus writes 3 words that mean almost nothing yet, and everything later. Wind of change. He does not know it, but he is about to hand his band and an entire crumbling empire an anthem for the end of an era. To understand why a German rock singer was awake in a Soviet hotel room scribbling lyrics, you have to go back further, to the strange path that had already brought the Scorpions this far behind the Iron Curtain. For more than a decade, Soviet teenagers had traded Scorpions cassettes hand to hand in secret, copies of copies, hissing and worn thin, smuggled past customs officers who were supposed to confiscate anything that smelled of the decadent West. Klaus knew the letters that occasionally reached the band, written in careful, halting English, describing basements where kids gathered around a single tape deck to hear guitars their own government pretended did not exist. So when word came in 1989 that the Kremlin itself, under Gorbachev's new policy of openness, would allow a real Western rock festival inside Moscow, the band almost could not believe it. The Moscow Music Peace Festival filled Lenin Stadium with more than 100,000 people, and the lineup alone felt like proof the world was tilting. Motley Crue was there, Bon Jovi was there, Ozzy Osbourne was there. Soldiers in uniform stood at the barricades not to keep a riot out, but to keep order among fans who had waited their entire lives for a night like this. Klaus walked out from backstage into a wall of sound and light and felt something physical move through his chest. For a musician who had built his career quietly behind a curtain of censorship, standing on a stage the Soviet Union had never permitted before, felt less like a concert and more like witnessing history hold its breath. Some of Klaus's clearest memories from that Moscow trip did not come from the stadium at all, but from an ordinary afternoon spent wandering through Gorky Park before the festival began. He walked along the Moskva riverbank with the rest of the band, past a slow-turning Ferris wheel and rows of benches filled with young Muscovites in faded blue jeans, sharing a single set of headphones between 2 or 3 friends at a time. Vendors sold ice cream from metal carts. Old men played chess under the trees, as if the world outside the park gates were not shifting beneath their feet. Klaus noticed how ordinary it all looked, and how extraordinary that ordinariness felt to him. A Western rock star walking freely through a Soviet public park without a minder in sight. It was this walk, more than anything on stage, that would later surface almost word for word in the song's opening lines. The Moskva drifting down toward Gorky Park, carrying with it a feeling Klaus could not yet name. What Klaus remembers most, though, did not happen under those lights. It happened at the Barricades, among boys who were not even fans, only soldiers doing their assigned duty. These were young conscripts, ordinary Red Army teenagers sent to maintain order among a crowd their own commanders quietly feared. But as the music rolled over the stadium, Klaus watched their stiff postures begin to soften. Rifles still slung over their shoulders, a few of them started mouthing the English lyrics they could not have possibly understood word for word. One boy nearest the stage swayed without seeming to notice he was doing it. Another, glancing sideways to be sure no officer was watching, sang along under his breath. These were young men trained to view Western music as a threat to be managed, and here they stood, quietly falling for it in real time, guarding a stage that was undoing the very system that had sent them there. That image lodged itself in Klaus's chest and refused to let go. After the show, he walked along the Moskva River embankment with a few of the other musicians, past golden domes lit up against the night sky, past young Muscovites who had gathered simply to be near the visiting Westerners, offering hand-carved pins, dog-eared photographs, even the shirts off their backs, in trade for anything that had touched a real rock star. Small pleasure boats drifted along the water, strung with lights, and for a moment the whole heavy stone city seemed to loosen at the edges. Klaus kept turning the same thought over. Something enormous is ending here, he told himself, and something else is being born, and I am one of the strangers lucky enough to be standing here, watching it happen. Back in his room at the Ukraina, sleep would not come. Klaus picked up a small guitar and let a simple, unfamiliar melody take shape in his hands. Something warm and open. Nothing like the driving hard rock riffs that had made the Scorpions famous across 3 continents. He began humming a phrase before he had real words for it at all. A whistled line that felt, to his own surprise, almost like a folk tune, drifting quietly over a border it was never supposed to cross. He thought about the boats on the river below, the current that kept moving no matter what stood along its banks, the soldiers who had sung words from a country that once called them the enemy. A phrase surfaced in his mind, half wonder and half disbelief at his own idea. Wind of change. It felt too plain, too gentle for a band known for leather jackets and sold-out arenas. He wrote it down anyway, unsure if it would ever be more than a private diary entry from one unforgettable, sleepless night in Moscow. The next morning, Klaus hesitated before showing anyone the notepad at all. When he finally hummed the melody for Rudolf Schenker, he braced for a polite shrug. The Scorpions had built an entire identity on volume and defiance, not on a whistled tune that sounded closer to a lullaby than a rock anthem. Rudolf listened quietly, asked him to play it again, and said nothing for a long moment that felt, to Klaus, far longer than it actually was. Then Rudolf nodded slowly and told him not to lose it. For weeks afterward, Klaus kept the folded lyric sheet in his bag like something fragile, half convinced the rest of the band would eventually decide it simply did not belong on a Scorpions record at all. When the Scorpions returned home to Germany that autumn, the Berlin Wall still stood, and Klaus said little publicly about the folded lyric sheet in his bag. The band went back on tour, playing packed European arenas through October and into November, and it was backstage after a show in early November that someone burst in with the news crackling out of a small transistor radio. The wall was open. People were walking through it with hammers and bare hands, tearing at concrete that had divided the country for 28 years. Klaus remembers the dressing room falling completely silent, road cases and half-finished drinks forgotten, as grown men who had grown up on opposite sides of a divided Germany stood together in front of that radio, unable to speak. For Klaus, The unfinished song in his bag suddenly stopped feeling like a private souvenir from a strange trip abroad. It felt instead like foresight, like he had already sensed months earlier, standing among singing soldiers in Lenin Stadium, exactly what was coming. By 1990, the Scorpions were in the studio recording what would become the album Crazy World, and Klaus finally brought his unfinished song fully into the light. He was nervous walking it into the room. This was a band whose entire catalog roared with distortion and defiance, and here was a ballad that opened not with a guitar, but with a whistle. Klaus almost cut that whistled intro entirely, worried it sounded too fragile, too soft for a band built on stadium rock. Producer Keith Olsen heard something else in it completely. He told Klaus he was listening to a bridge between two worlds, the same bridge Klaus had stood on that sleepless night above the Moskva River, and he pushed the band to trust the song exactly as it had come to Klaus, whistle and all, without softening it into something safer. The whistle itself, the sound that would end up carrying the song around the world, almost never made it onto tape at all. In the vocal booth, Klaus tried recording it take after take, self-conscious about something so simple sitting at the very front of a Scorpions record. Engineers in the control room kept quiet, letting him work through his own doubt rather than pushing him. On what he later called the least dramatic take of the session, almost an afterthought, he finally whistled it clean and unhurried, exactly the way it had first come to him, half asleep above the Moskva River, and everyone in the room understood immediately that this was the one. There was no dramatic debate afterward, no long meeting about whether to keep it. It simply stayed, note for note, the way a memory stays once it is settled into its true shape. When Wind of Change was finally released as a single in January of 1991, not even Klaus fully grasped what was about to happen. It did not simply climb the charts, it became the unofficial soundtrack of an entire historical turning point, a ballad that seemed to speak for millions of people living through the collapse of the Iron Curtain in real time. In a newly reunified Germany, it played from every radio like a hymn for a country stitching itself back together after decades apart. In the crumbling Soviet Union, where the song's very first seed had been planted in a hotel room the band could barely believe they had been allowed inside, bootleg copies once again circulated hand to hand, except now the lyrics matched the headlines instead of quietly defying them. Word eventually reached Klaus that Soviet listeners, and later Mikhail Gorbachev himself, understood the song as something rare, a piece of Western rock that did not gloat over the fall of the old order, but seemed to genuinely mourn it and celebrate it in the same breath, the way one mourns a childhood home while still walking eagerly towards something better. When an attempted coup shook Moscow and briefly threatened to unseat Gorbachev in August of 1991, people later said the song played in the back of their minds through those tense, uncertain days, an anthem for a future nobody could yet guarantee. Klaus, once a singer smuggled into Soviet living rooms on worn-out cassette tape, was now being credited with writing one of the emotional touchstones of the Cold War's final, trembling year. Years after Wind of Change had already become an anthem, Klaus found himself standing face-to-face with Mikhail Gorbachev at an event honoring the very changes the song had come to represent. Gorbachev reportedly told him the melody had reached further into ordinary Soviet households than any speech or policy briefing ever could, translating an entire political upheaval into something people could hum on their way to work. Klaus also returned to Moscow to perform the song live again, this time not smuggled onto pirated tape, but broadcast openly, sung back to him by crowds who no longer needed to whisper the lyrics or glance over their shoulders while they listened. Watching it happen, Klaus often said, felt like closing a circle that had opened that sleepless night in the Hotel Ukraina, a private scribble on a hotel notepad now belonging to millions of strangers who had lived through the same ending he had only glimpsed first. For anyone who lived through those years, the ones who remember exactly where they were the night the wall came down, or who once owned a scratchy imported record and did not fully understand why a hard rock band from Hanover suddenly sounded so tender, Wind of Change was never just another radio hit. It was a marker, a song that let an entire generation feel for 3.5 minutes that the fear they had carried since childhood, the fear of a divided world locked in permanent standoff, was finally allowed to loosen its grip. Even now, decades on, when the Scorpions step onto a stage and Klaus lifts that first familiar whistle into the air, audiences who lived through the Cold War do not just hear a nostalgic melody. They hear their own history handed back to them, the same wind that once moved through a hotel room in Moscow, still moving through the room they are standing in tonight. Decades later, Klaus Meine still returns to that one memory above all others: the narrow hotel room, the pencil, the boats drifting on the Moskva River beneath a sky he could not have known was already changing. Wind of Change would go on to sell more than 14 million copies, translated and covered and played at moments of political upheaval far beyond Germany and Russia, long outliving the empire that had unintentionally inspired it. But for Klaus, the song never stops tracing back to that one restless night in 1989, a hard rock frontman alone with a pen, listening to soldiers hum along to music they had been sent to silence, and somehow finding the exact words for a wind that, by then, no wall on earth could have stopped.